At the close of World War II, the world was left with a sprawling network of military technologies that were no longer required for active combat but were instead caught in the crosshairs of post-war geopolitics. Among these technologies, the German rocket programs, which had fueled some of the most advanced and terrifying weaponry of the war, represented both a tremendous scientific achievement and a dangerous asset in the wrong hands. The fate of these programs, particularly those involving captured German scientists, engineers, and their innovations, would come to define not only the Cold War's early years but also the emergence of space exploration and missile technology in the ensuing decades. In the final years of the conflict, the Germans had developed sophisticated rocket systems, most notably the V-2 missile, which had already made a deadly impact on Allied cities. These rockets were a symbol of Germany's technical prowess but also a demonstration of their disastrous military ambitions. As the Third Reich crumbled, the immediate question was not just how to halt their destructive potential, but what to do with the intricate web of research, knowledge, and the highly skilled workforce that had contributed to this technology. The rocket programs, especially the V-2, were inherently complex and involved a range of materials, scientific disciplines, and infrastructure spread across various sites in Germany. The complexity of the programs meant that they did not simply vanish with the fall of the Reich, leaving behind a treasure trove of rockets, blueprints, and the scientific minds behind them. However, the war's end brought with it an overwhelming set of logistical and political realities. Both the United States and the Soviet Union, two of the dominant post-war powers, quickly recognized the potential value of the captured German rocket technology. For the Americans, in particular, the acquisition of this technology would provide an immediate and critical advantage in the race for post-war scientific and military supremacy. At the same time, the Soviets sought to claim as much of the German technological legacy as possible, fearing that American control of such advanced technology would tip the balance of power in the West's favor. Thus, the two superpowers, despite their ideological differences, had a shared interest in the acquisition of Germany's rocket expertise. In the chaotic aftermath of the war, the immediate question for the Allies was how to secure and manage the scientific and technological assets left behind by the Germans. As early as 1945, British and American forces began sweeping through occupied German territory, searching for key research papers, prototypes, and missile components. The most significant of these was the Mittelwerk factory in the Harz Mountains, which had been the production site for the V-2 rockets. There, amidst the ruins, soldiers discovered not only the remains of the V-2 missiles but also the work of Wernher von Braun and his team of engineers, who had led the rocket program. Initially, the Americans were focused on securing the personnel and knowledge that had been central to the German rocket program. The process of rounding up key figures was methodical and strategic. It was not simply a matter of seizing technology, but of extracting the minds that had made it possible. This marked the beginning of what would become known as Operation Paperclip, an effort by the U.S. to bring as many German scientists, engineers, and technicians as possible into the fold of American research and development. For many of these individuals, their skills were too valuable to be left in the hands of the Soviet Union or other nations. The immediate concern was not the ethical or moral considerations, but the urgent need to leverage this technological advantage in a world suddenly divided into opposing superpowers. The initial move by the Americans involved relocating German scientists and their families to the U.S., often in secrecy. Some of these individuals, including von Braun himself, had been integral to the development of the V-2 rocket and had experienced firsthand the devastating consequences of their work. Von Braun, for instance, would later recount his mixed feelings about working for the Nazis, having initially joined the regime with the goal of advancing rocket science, but ultimately becoming disillusioned with the war effort. Nevertheless, by the time the war had ended, his focus was squarely on the development of missile and space technology, a direction that would guide his future endeavors in America. By late 1945, the United States had already begun to integrate the captured rocket technology into its own programs. V-2 rockets, along with a host of related designs and materials, were shipped to America for further study. In parallel, the U.S. began constructing the infrastructure needed to build on this technological foundation. The establishment of the Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, which would become a major hub for the American rocket program, was one of the first tangible steps in harnessing the knowledge gained from the Germans. At the same time, the Soviets were not sitting idle. In the same period, they were securing their own share of the German rocket legacy. By October 1945, Soviet teams were already combing through German rocket sites, extracting technical documents, and transporting captured equipment back to the Soviet Union. The Soviets' aim was not just to replicate the German technology but to advance it as part of their broader quest to become a dominant global power. This included the forced relocation of German engineers to the Soviet Union, a practice not unlike that of the Americans. Soviet authorities understood that rocket technology would be crucial in the development of military missiles, as well as future space exploration initiatives, both of which were already emerging as central themes in post-war geopolitics. For all the scientific progress these programs represented, the aftermath of the war also highlighted the extent of the destruction caused by Germany's relentless military production. The Mittelwerk facility, once a bustling center of rocket production, had been established with the forced labor of concentration camp inmates, whose lives were destroyed in the pursuit of these weapons. The legacy of the V2 program was thus intertwined with profound moral and ethical questions, which many of the captured scientists would have to confront as they embarked on their new roles in the United States and Soviet Union. The question of what to do with the captured German rocket programs also extended to the physical remnants of the war. The thousands of V2 missiles, components, and facilities left behind in Germany became an immediate challenge for both the U.S. and the USSR. In some cases, missiles were dismantled and parts were shipped off to be studied, while in other instances, whole sections of the factories were either abandoned or destroyed to prevent them from falling into the hands of the other side. As for the remaining missiles, many of them were simply scrapped, repurposed, or left to rot in the warehouses and silos that had once been used for their assembly. These rockets, once symbols of the Nazis' devastating military reach, became obsolete relics of the past. In the United States, the V2 rockets were largely studied for their potential military application. Engineers worked to understand the intricacies of the German designs, hoping to develop similar systems that could be used in the development of long-range missiles and the nascent U.S. space program. By 1949, the first American-built rocket based on the V2, the Redstone rocket, was already under development, signaling the beginning of the U.S. missile and space race. However, the fate of the German rocket technology was not entirely sealed. In some cases, the capture of German assets was viewed with skepticism by some military and political officials, who questioned the value of continuing to develop what were, after all, weapons of war. As the immediate post-war years unfolded, the future of the rocket programs would continue to evolve. Decisions made during this time would shape not only the future of missile technology but also the course of space exploration itself. In the years following World War II, the future of the captured German rocket programs slowly unfolded as a combination of technical progress, political maneuvering, and intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. By 1947, both superpowers had already established their respective footholds in the rocket race, with German scientists and technology at the heart of their ambitions. What had initially been the technological remains of Nazi Germany's military arsenal would go on to shape the future of missile systems, the space race, and even modern warfare itself. The fate of the captured rocket programs, however, was far from certain, and their final outcome would be shaped by the growing tensions of the Cold War, the need for rapid technological advancement, and the complex ethical dilemmas that accompanied the integration of Nazi-era scientists into new political contexts. As the Americans and Soviets pursued their own versions of the captured German rocket programs, the division between East and West grew ever more pronounced. The American efforts, spearheaded by Wernher von Braun and his team, initially focused on improving the military capabilities of the United States. In the early days, the V2 rocket, now repurposed for American use, was primarily viewed through the lens of its military potential. The Redstone rocket, which was developed based on V2 technology, was seen as a key component of America's missile defense strategy. By the early 1950s, the United States had successfully launched the first Redstone missile, which became the foundation for more advanced missile systems that would later lead to the development of the Titan and Minuteman rockets. In many ways, these advancements were directly tied to the work of the German scientists brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Von Braun, who had been an architect of the V-2 missile, became one of the most prominent figures in America's rocket program. His work would eventually lead to the creation of the Saturn V rocket, which played a crucial role in landing Americans on the moon in 1969. However, the political and moral implications of the program's origins were never fully resolved. Von Braun, along with his colleagues, had been an integral part of a regime responsible for war crimes, and many of the rocket program's advancements had come at a staggering human cost. Though von Braun would go on to become a celebrated figure in American science, the question of his wartime involvement remained a dark shadow over his career. For the Soviet Union, the trajectory of the captured German rocket programs took a different path. After acquiring significant amounts of technology and personnel, the Soviets began rapidly developing their own missile systems. The first Soviet missile, the UN, was essentially a copy of the German V-2. But in the years that followed, the Soviets made significant strides in their rocket technology, creating more powerful and sophisticated systems. The R-7, which emerged from this early Soviet work, would eventually become the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, and was used to launch the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. While the Soviets were not as open as the Americans in their integration of German scientists, the need for expertise was undeniable. The Soviet Union also took its own approach to acquiring the intellectual property left behind by the Nazis. As with the Americans, the Soviet leadership moved swiftly to transport German engineers, scientists, and technicians to the Soviet Union, often using coercive measures to ensure their cooperation. Many of these individuals were housed in specially constructed facilities and worked under the supervision of Soviet authorities, who were keen to exploit their knowledge for both military and civilian purposes. By the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union had established its own network of missile facilities, and the R-7 was already poised to change the global balance of power. The development of ICBMs and the eventual successful launch of Sputnik represented a major victory for Soviet missile technology. However, as with the American program, the legacy of the German scientists was not without its complications. Many of the key figures in the Soviet program, like their American counterparts, had been involved in the creation of weapons used in the mass destruction of civilian populations. The moral dilemmas that accompanied the recruitment of these individuals, as well as the ongoing questions about their wartime activities, lingered throughout the Cold War. However, in both the United States and the Soviet Union, the strategic imperative to develop military supremacy outweighed any ethical concerns, and the race for technological dominance continued unabated. The fate of the captured German rockets themselves was also shaped by the pressures of post-war reconstruction. While the Germans had developed a sophisticated infrastructure for their missile programs, much of this was either destroyed or repurposed by the occupying powers. The V-2 factories, for example, were largely dismantled or left in ruins, and the missiles themselves were often taken apart for study. However, some remnants of the German rocket programs managed to survive in the form of test launches, experimental projects, and the vast stockpiles of missile parts left behind in storage facilities across Europe. These remnants became important resources for both the United States and the Soviet Union, who used them to advance their own missile programs. The end of the war had left Germany in a state of utter devastation, and much of the rocket technology that had once been a centerpiece of Nazi military aspirations was now scattered across Europe. The United States, in particular, faced enormous logistical challenges in retrieving these assets. In many cases, the task of recovering the missiles and components required extensive efforts, including the rebuilding of destroyed transport networks and the extraction of parts from bombed-out factories. This process took months, even years, to complete, but the value of the captured technology made these efforts worthwhile. The Americans, in particular, were able to recover a significant portion of the German rocket stockpile, which played a pivotal role in the development of the U.S. missile defense systems and the early space exploration programs. The fate of these rockets was not entirely decided by the Americans and Soviets. The remnants of the German rocket programs were also studied by other nations, particularly in Europe. British and French authorities, for instance, were keen to learn from the Germans' advancements in rocket technology, though they were not as successful as the Americans and Soviets in incorporating this knowledge into their own military and space programs. In some cases, the British worked closely with the Americans to jointly develop missile systems, although their efforts were often overshadowed by the massive American investment in missile technology. As the Cold War unfolded, the legacy of the captured German rocket programs would continue to shape the global arms race. The knowledge and infrastructure gained from these programs contributed significantly to the development of both military missile systems and the space race. The V-2, in particular, served as a launching pad for the development of more advanced rockets, culminating in the U.S. Saturn V rocket and the Soviet Union's R-7 ICBM. The German rocket programs, once a symbol of Nazi military might, had become the foundation for the future of missile defense and space exploration. What had been a weapon of terror and destruction was now the key to a new era of technological progress.